华尔街简报来自各大权威媒体与机构专业的独特分析。观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的华尔街简报，我是信峰。昨天，彭博社报道了美国国务卿布林肯几周内将会访华的消息。今天，美国的《华尔街日报》则带来了进一步的讯息，美国和中国正在为布林肯可能的访问做准备。据双方官员称，华盛顿和北京正在为布林肯本月晚些时候可能访问北京做准备，其中可能包括与中国领导人习近平进行会晤。今年2月的间谍气球事件推迟了布林肯原本要进行的访华，并使两国关系直线下降。其中一名官员透露，在北京期间，布林肯预计将会会见中国高级官员，其中包括高级外交官员王毅和外交部长秦刚。知情人士说，目前尚未决定是否将会与习近平会面。重新安排这次访问将重启高层交流，并且阻止两国关系进一步的恶化。在美国的东亚事务高级官员克里滕·布林克本周访问北京之后，布林肯的出访计划正在加速安排。中国驻美大使馆发言人刘鹏宇最近说，中国愿意与美方进行对话，希望美方与中国相向而行。最近，中美双方为改善关系做出了微妙的努力。今年2月，负责亚洲事务的副助理财政部长卡普罗斯对中国官员进行了初步访问，为耶伦之后的访问打了头阵。上个月，中国商务部长王文涛在华盛顿则会见了美国商务部长雷蒙多，讨论了贸易和投资问题。上周，一名美国官员还透露，中央情报局局长伯恩斯也于今年5月秘密访问了中国。布林肯的成功访问可能为耶伦和雷蒙多随后的访问铺平道路。关于他们的访问，两国政府已经讨论了好几个月。华尔街日报指出，这一系列的访问如果按计划进行，将在某种程度上重新设定拜登和习近平在去年11月会晤中制定的计划，并且将表明中美双方仍然决心要解决从贸易争端到安全威胁和经济分歧等一系列的问题。南华早报报道，苹果隔空投送成为焦点，中国采取行动限制文件共享。出于国家安全的原因，中国正计划规范手机与手机之间的文件共享功能，此举预计将会影响苹果的 AirDrop， 也就是隔空投送。根据中国最高互联网监管机构网信办发布的草案，新规则旨在限制任何依靠 Wi-Fi、蓝牙和其他信息技术的近距离文件传输服务。网信办周二公布了这一草案，并且启动为期1个月的公众咨询。此举是北京维护国家安全的最新举措。苹果手机的文件隔空投送功能在去年冬天反对疫情封锁的公众示威活动中被使用，并且在2019年的香港反政府抗议活动中也被使用。它可以将文件发送给你附近的不认识的任何苹果手机，只要对方的接收功能已经打开。而其他手机最近也推出了类似的无线通信功能，比如说谷歌的 FastShare、vivo、小米和 OPPO 也提供类似的与同类手机之间的文件传输服务。网信办的新规则规定，如果科技公司希望包含任何可用于公共表达和社会动员的功能，则必须接受全面的安全评估。此类功能面向的所有用户也必须以真实姓名进行过注册。上海华东政法大学的法学教授高福平解释，实名注册要求旨在填补隔空投送功能在传播内容控制上的漏洞。中国在10年前就开始要求网络发言实名制，微博和微信等网络平台都只有实名注册后才能发言。高福平教授解释，这一法规的核心目标是确保所有信息传输都可以被追踪，以防出现问题。苹果的隔空投送功能于2011年推出，是一种方便的工具，可以通过 Wi-Fi 或者蓝牙与附近的用户共享文件，而无需依赖互联网。图像也可以匿名发送，接收者可以不知道是谁发给你的，只能够看到对方手机的昵称。苹果的 iPhone 手机在中国大陆占据了移动设备市场份额的1/5，在香港则占到约1半的份额。去年11月，中国多个城市爆发了抗议活动，西方媒体曾经报道，隔空投送当时被用来分享反政府图片，或者邀请公众加入示威。随后，苹果在操作系统的更新当中，对大陆苹果手机的隔空投送功能设置了10分钟的时间限制，被视为是对中国政府的讨好。香港大学法学副教授张胡月认为，新规则不太可能对整个科技行业产生重大影响，因为它似乎主要就是针对苹果的隔空投送功能。 通过隔空投送传输的文件，即使不接收，也可以先在手机上看到图片的预览。网信办的规则则要求苹果关闭这一预览功能，也就是说，用户必须先点击接收同意才能够看到图片。可以说，这套新的规则是规定的非常详细。近年来，国际社会也一直有人呼吁，像苹果这样的大型科技公司需要修改隔空投送的功能，以避免可能的滥用，因为犯罪分子可以轻易地通过它来分享不合适的图片来骚扰附近用户。另外，昨天我们报道了美国风险投资巨头红杉资本剥离中国业务的消息，而今天彭博社发表了深入报道，披露了一些红杉资本在宣布剥离中国业务之前与国会山的紧张关系。红杉资本的拆分可能会使红杉免受一些针对中国的投资监管，但是这也是一个信号，表明与中国的关系在硅谷是一个越来越大的责任。据知情人士透露，近年来红杉资本在华盛顿建立了低调但是强大的影响力。就在几周前，红杉资本曾经闭门向国会山强调，它的美国业务和中国业务是分开的。红杉资本和红杉中国共同持有的 TikTok 投资成为了它被关注的爆发点。在红杉于2014年首次投资字节跳动之后， TikTok 在美国迅速发展并且广受欢迎，最终引发了政府对中国收集美国人数据的担忧。据知情人士透露，在 TikTok 紧张局势加剧之际，红杉领导人意识到他在国会需要更多的帮助。2019年年中，红杉就曾经向美国司法部前官员维埃拉求助。维埃拉曾经帮助红杉在国会山吹风红杉资本和红杉中国是分开的这一信息。上个月，在众议院与中国竞争特别委员会的会议上，维埃拉还告诉政策制定者，红杉的美国合作伙伴没有参与中国的决策。然而，国会官员对此持怀疑态度，他们认为红杉的美中双方有太多的联系，不容忽视，比如说两个实体之间的联合合规行动和收入分享协议等等。国会认为红杉可能无法控制红杉中国做出的每一个决定，但仍然从其中国子公司赚钱。据知情人士透露，美国政府计划中的行政命令将于今年晚些时候发布，该命令将要求风险投资公司报告对可能敏感的中国技术的投资，并且可能限制他们的下注金额。以上就是本期华尔街简报的全部内容。更多全球最新资讯可以关注六度简报网站，网址是6度brief.com。在上面大家可以订阅各类符合你喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更专业定制的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的节目就是这样，感谢您的收看，我们下期节目再见。
欢迎收看华尔街电视评论。李强知道坏消息即将到来。南华早报评论版：中国的贸易数据显示，经济复苏形势严峻，需要更加关注国内市场。与去年同期相比，今年5月的出口额下降了 7.5%， 进口额下降了 4.5%。尽管以人民币计算，出口额下降了 0.8%， 进口额增长了 2.3%， 但这些数据仍然表明经济复苏步伐疲软。市场对未来经济走势持不同看法，制造业采购经理人指数显示收缩和增长的矛盾信号。面对失业问题、外国投资者信心不足以及地方政府债务水平的挑战，中国政府采取了打击不公平竞争和垄断的措施，以改善外国投资者准入。这些举措旨在建立一个统一的国内市场，以推动政策和恢复投资者信心。中国经济正面临重组不同行业和部门的关键时刻，虽然有人被解雇，但也在创造新的工作岗位。然而，年轻人失业对于人口众多的中国来说，并不是一个好兆头。在经济增长的关键时刻，人民银行面临降息的压力，但可能还有其他工具可供运用，比如降低银行存款准备金率，以释放流动资金进入经济。政府需要将增长、就业创造和安全放在政策规划的核心位置，以推动经济的发展。德国飞行员只是把北约的战术船递给了中国吗？外交政策：欧洲需要停止低估中国蓬勃发展的军事实力对其安全构成的威胁，特别是当其与北京对现有全球秩序的修正主义观点结合在一起时，欧洲的安全和繁荣就依赖于这一秩序。如果欧洲希望保持和平与安全，它的漫不经心态度需要迅速改变。欧洲对中国军事野心的冷淡态度很容易解释。首先，最有可能的军事对抗围绕台湾的冲突可能最终演变为东亚的高强度战争，主要被视为美中之间的斗争。 其次，欧洲人对中国军事问题的认知认为这超出了他们的军事职责范围，这得到了美国国防决策者的支持。欧洲应该在自身防卫上投入更多军事资源，而不是在对抗中国、围绕台湾的潜在战争中做出次要的军事贡献。换句话说，美国军事规划者认为，在这种分工中，欧洲终于能够在少量的美国支持下自卫，而美国则将专注于亚洲以遏制中国的侵略浪潮。这不仅是华盛顿所希望的分工，而且很可能也是欧洲所希望的。即使在台湾冲突发生时，欧洲当然可以派遣战斗部队到亚洲。然而，德国和英国军事飞行员培训中国飞行员破坏了这种分工。然而，欧洲对其公民向北京传递军事机密的不够关注，主要原因是许多欧洲政府对军事威胁缺乏严肃态度。这并不令人意外。多年来，欧洲工业直接或间接地通过向俄罗斯提供军事装备、双用途技术，包括用于制造复杂武器的精密制造技术和其他支持，直至2020年帮助了俄罗斯的军备建设。乌克兰战争最终迫使西欧对俄罗斯更加重视，但对来自中国的威胁仍然天真。欧洲将军事机密传递给中国，不仅会让美国及其盟友在亚洲的任何战争变得更加艰难，也会加强对手并让他们了解自己的战术，从而使在任何地区遏制未来战争的工作更加困难。这就是为什么欧洲担心俄罗斯而不担心中国是错误的。美国在东亚与中国潜在战争中所需的军事装备，正是欧洲为了维持对俄罗斯充足威慑所需要的军事装备。这包括精确制导弹药、远程防空系统、无人机、用于情报、监视、侦察、ISR、电子战、预警和空中加油的飞机、网络侦察能力以及基于空间的 ISR 平台。华盛顿根本没有足够的这些高端平台和能力来供应，而欧洲所做的任何有助于中国的行为，都意味着美国需要将更多装备转移到亚洲。尽管乌克兰的事件唤醒了他们，但欧洲国家，特别是德国，在重新投资这些高端能力方面进展缓慢。大多数欧洲军队要再次精通高强度战争，包括复杂的电子压制和武器破坏行动，将需要很多年时间。这正是俄罗斯空军在乌克兰一直在努力解决的问题，也无疑是中国空军目前正在努力解决的问题。德国国防部长鲍里斯·皮斯托利乌斯在与中国国防部长会晤时，要求北京停止聘请前德国空军飞行员培训中国战斗机飞行员。显然，对敌对方的礼貌请求是不够的。作为首要行动，欧洲各国政府应通过立法禁止其公民和企业以任何方式援助中国人民解放军。然而，要改变欧洲对中国军事威胁的整体心态将更加困难。然而，即使巴黎、伦敦或柏林可能不会遭到中国导弹的袭击，欧洲仍应该放弃对中国军事实力的天真幻想。考虑到超级大国之间的潜在冲突的规模和破坏程度，即使美国获胜，也需要多年时间来重建其军队，几乎没有多余的力量可供欧洲使用。欧洲应该不惜一切代价避免这种军事间隔期，通过更加认真地对待军事威慑，包括美国对中国的威慑比过去更加重视。是时候结束欧洲的天真幻想了。中国在亚洲的军事侵略的直接和间接后果将对欧洲的安全造成灾难性影响。社交媒体演算法不受保护，国会删报观点，用户是一种受到第一修正案保护的言论形式。然而，这一论点未能区分平台上发布的视频和 AI 算法的输出。前者通常享有第一修正案的保护，即使它们促使产生有害反应。但是，后者 AI 算法的实际推荐和传递方式是自主机器的产物。如果这些输出导致成瘾或其他伤害，通常如此，它既不是言论，也不免于消费者安全监管。社交媒体平台通常使用两种不同的 AI 系统。第一种用于内容审核，决定哪些用户内容可以在平台上发布，哪些应该被拒绝。平台在这方面拥有广泛的自由裁量权，无论是自动化还是人工审核。内容审核是公共讨论的入口，我们依赖平台负责的过滤内容。某些人可能会对平台的选择持不同意见，但在进行等同于传统编辑职能的过滤功能时，平台享有第一修正案的保护。但是，驱动推荐算法的第二种 AI 机制并不履行第一修正案所依据的任何目的。AI 的内部运作只是执行特定功能的计算机代码，它不使用人类可理解的语言进行沟通。AI 的计算结果及其推荐也是功能性的，而非表达性的，其主要目的是让用户保持参与度。即使绕过听众的认知功能，直接引发及时的本能反应，例如威胁、煽动、 挑衅性言论和在拥挤的剧院里大声喊火警，这种实际言论在第一修正案范畴之外。当言辞引发行动时，它们被视为行为而非言论。将 AI 推荐视为言论的最大问题在于它们是由自主机器生成的。平台操作员所做的只是给 AI 设定一个目标，通常是最大化用户在平台上的时间。AI 会自主学习如何构建和传递推荐以实现该目标。AI 的决策没有人类的自由裁量、判断或编辑参与。简而言之，你对 ChatGPT 的提示是受到言论保护的，但 AI 的输出则不受保护。目前 AI 的输出已在社会各个领域进行推荐，包括贷款、政府福利、就业机会、被告的判决条件、新闻阅读、产品购买、音乐收听、搜索结果、欺诈手段、监视、歧视和财产损失。我们真的希望认为所有这些自主机器行为都受到第一修正案的保护吗？如果是这样，并且我们将 AI 的输出视为言论，那么 AI 将免于受到监管。为什么联合国仍然很重要？大国竞争和中国角色。外交事务。根据外交事务的一篇文章，联合国 UN 可能会从美国和中国之间日益激烈的竞争中受益。事实上，长期的竞争可能导致更多的合作，特别是在维护安全理事会的权利方面。两国在保持对其他国家的权利方面都有潜在的利益，但他们将不得不控制零和思维，并在联合国中找到符合其共同利益的共同点。迄今为止，联合国在定义包括乌克兰战争和叙利亚冲突在内的事件方面已被证明是无效的，导致许多人认为该组织受到大国反对派的阻碍。联合国内部的大国竞争演变和中国在塑造组织未来的角色。以下是一些要点。历史上的合作，尽管成员间存在竞争，安全理事会曾经见证了合作日益增长的时期。理事会处理了重大问题并通过的决议往往比被否决或无法获得多数支持的决议更严格。组织内部竞争，随着二战后帝国的解体，许多曾被殖民的国家纷纷加入联合国。综合考虑了非洲、亚洲和拉丁美洲国家的利益，联合国大会很快被非对齐运动国家所主导，他们越来越多地利用联合国作为平台，表达与超级大国意见不合的立场。为了展示安全理事会的主导地位，苏联和美国都希望展现合作，以避免激化大会的主动权。苏美在雅尔达达成的大国协定赋予他们前所未有的权利，但为行使这些权利，他们必须合作。冷战结束后的联合国，随着冷战结束，美国成为世界上无可争议的超级大国，联合国在这一新政治格局中活跃起来。虽然也出现了重大失误，如1994年卢旺达种族屠杀，但该组织通常在当时的地缘政治中扮演重要角色。从1990至1991年的海湾战争到巴尔干危机、柬埔寨、东帝汶等地的危机，维和行动进一步扩大，特别是在非洲，因为苏联解体导致许多政权失去外部支持并开始崩溃。联合国还深度参与解决环境、公共卫生和国际刑事司法等一系列新问题。中国的兴起，21世纪中国的崛起使世界进入了一个新的大国竞争时代。在中国领导人习近平的带领下，中国变得更加强大，民族主义化和好战。在美国政治纷扰的背景下，对中国的反对往往更加强硬。许多分析人士已经将这种日益增长的竞争形容为一场新的冷战。中国在联合国的作用日益活跃。过去，中国在组织中的角色相对较低调，直到1971年，中国的联合国席位由台湾拥有。中国在安全理事会经常弃权，但从20世纪90年代开始，中国开始更加频繁地投票并行使否决权。事实上，自2011年以来，中国已经行使了12次否决权。相比之下，美国在同一时期只否决了4个决议。在大会方面，中国最近提出了一项全球发展倡议，一项经济进展的综合计划，以及在博鳌亚洲论坛上提出的一项全球安全倡议，旨在以双赢的心态应对复杂且相互关联的安全挑战。这些提议都旨在重新定向全球治理，确保中国处于主导地位。总之，美国和中国都从联合国的现状中受益。尽管这种高度不平等的权力分配常常令其他会员国感到沮丧，但对于那些主导组织的国家来说，这种现状是有利的。联合国的工作与其他安全理事会成员的合作密切相关。美中2国共同授权了中非共和国、马里和南苏丹等地的最近维和或稳定行动，并对海地实施制裁、武器禁运和其他限制。仅在2023年就通过了关于朝鲜半岛威胁、伊朗核问题、 叙利亚和乌克兰冲突以及其他争议性问题的决议数十个。这些事件表明，大国竞争在联合国内部的影响力正在日益增强，并且中国作为新兴大国正在发挥更重要的角色。南非的普京问题，外交政策。南非正在考虑中国提出主办8月金砖国家峰会的提议，其中包括中国、俄罗斯、南非、巴西和印度的领导人。此举将抵消普利托里亚在国际法院规定的义务方面对比勒陀利亚施加的外交压力。该法院要求该国逮捕俄罗斯总统弗拉基米尔·普京在乌克兰冲突期间犯下的战争罪。在失业、能源危机和经济衰退等国内问题中，对俄罗斯的支援加剧了南非的经济困难。南非还将在2025年主办 G20 峰会。摩洛哥与中国的 GOTEN 高科技公司签署了在该国建立电动汽车电池工厂的协定。这笔交易得到了64亿美元的支援，使其成为非洲第一家此类工厂。摩洛哥的目标是在可再生能源生产和电动汽车制造方面引领非洲大陆。该国去年超过南非，成为非洲领先的乘用车出口国。苏丹臭名昭著的准军事组织快速支援部队 RSF 占领了该国的国家博物馆，试图识别和追捕伊斯兰政党穆斯林兄弟会的成员。博物馆收藏了包含苏丹文化遗产的物品，包括可追溯到西元前2500年至西元前1500年的文物。此举引发了人们对文物会被损坏、摧毁或出售到国外的担忧。虽然局势已经解决，但人权组织表示，无国界医生组织在达尔富尔和其他地方犯下了许多战争罪行。契约奴役 HEB 工作者经常换工作。卡托研究所，大卫 J 比尔 David J 比尔。对于技术熟练的外籍工人的 HEB 签证，批评者们经常声称这个身份等同于契约奴役。契约奴役是指在一段预定期间内无薪地为单一雇主工作的合约。然而 HEB 工人不仅有薪水，而且他们的薪资在美国属于前 10% 的高收入人群。同样重要的是，尽管他们面临更多转换工作的障碍， HEB 工人并不受限于单一雇主，并且经常换工作。事实上， HEB 工人离开他们最初的 HEB 雇主的情况比以往更多。图一显示了根据财政年度计算， HEB 工人转换到新雇主的数量。从2005年到2022年， HEB 工人共换工作了近100万次。转换的次数从2005年的约 2.4 万次增加到2022年创下的纪录，达到了130576次，增长了超过5倍。实际上， HEB 转换工作比首次开始 HEB 就业更为普遍。2022年，约 51% 的所有以新雇主开始的 HEB 工人都是从其他美国雇主挖角来的现有 HEB 工人。这意味着美国雇主更有可能聘请已经在美国以 HEB 身份工作的 HEB 工人，而不是聘请尚未拥有 HEB 身份的新 HEB 工人。这种转换增加的原因有多种可能。劳动力市场一般上更加紧张，导致更多的工作变动。此外，现在有更多的 HEB 工人在美国为其他雇主工作，而且自2014年以来， HEB 签证额度每年都很快就被填满，这使得挖角的动机更大。政府在2017年还通过给予 HEB 工人失业后60天的宽限期来换工作，使转换 HEB 工作变得更容易。最后，2021年转换工作的增加至少部分归因于当年提交的绿卡申请数量创下的纪录。在提交绿卡申请后180天，HEB 工人可以在不需要雇主重新启动绿卡程序的情况下换工作，从而简化了换工作的过程。然而，2022年待处理的基于就业的绿卡申请数量减少，所以这只是故事的一部分。当然， HEB 工人在劳动市场上仍然没有得到平等对待。新的 HEB 雇主需要支付高昂的费用来挖角他们，而对于印度工人来说，绿卡的短缺可能会让他们觉得必须驰援雇主以完成绿卡流程。最好的解决方案是将转换为绿卡的过程自动化，而不需要在3年后进行续签。60天的寻找新工作宽限期仍然不足以让许多工人有信心在没有新工作的情况下放弃问题工作。尽管政府设立了人为的转换障碍，广泛存在的 HEB 转换工作室时尚否定了 HEB 工人是契约奴役的观点。皮尤研究中心报告称，2022年每个月有 2.1% 的大学毕业生换工作。估计 HEB 工人的人数约为58万。尽管数据不能直接进行比较，但根据2022年的近13.1万次 HEB 转换，这意味着每月的工作变动率为 1.9% 较低，但绝不像契约奴役的言辞夸张。事实上， 政府通过设立人位障碍来阻碍 H-1B 工人的工作变动，这使得 H-1B 系统内仍然存在助寻找更好就业的选择。政府应该扩大这些选择，而不是试图减少或淘汰这些在科学、技术、工程、数学和医学领域做出如此重要贡献的工人。郊区仍在推动美国政治，但他们将把我们带到哪里？纽约时报评论版。在过去的50年里，随着美国黑人从市中心搬到附近的郊区，美国的政治格局发生了变化。此举恰逢郊区黑人生活水准的提高，而城市居民的弱势群体则被抛在了后面。根据分别来自伊利诺伊大学和圣母大学的亚历山大、巴蒂克和埃文·马斯特的说法，从1970年开始，居住在大城市郊区的美国黑人人口从 16% 上升到 36%。到2020年，居住在大都市统计区的美国黑人中有 51.3% 居住在郊区。然而，根据宾夕法尼亚州立大学的社会学家的说法，融合的希望已经受挫。研究发现，白人抵抗意味着白人家庭要么离开学区，要么无法进入学区。有一个知道什么时候闭嘴的总统真是太好了。纽约时报评论版。拜登总统最近的政治态度凸显出，沉默有时可能是接近国会的最佳方式。凭藉低调的性格，他设法避开了典型的美国媒体方法。这种方法奖励技巧，以吸引人们对确保立法和创造渐进式变革的看似平凡的工作的关注。这常常使希望他采取更有利立场的进步派和温和派感到沮丧。然而，他的方法意味着更多的雷达立法仍然可以通过。这些技能植根于他多年的立法者经验，为处理国会政治创造了重要的见解。这激怒了他的支援者，他们渴望更引人注目的形象，但这种策略有助于推动更关键的立法，而没有通常围绕政策制定的大张旗鼓或争议。谢谢大家收看华尔街电视评论。
Hi. Welcome, everyone. I am Walter Mead, the Ravenel Curry Fellow here at Hudson Institute, and today I'm really very fortunate, very happy to welcome Dr. Kurt Campbell to join us. Dr. Campbell is the coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs on the National Security Council, which means he holds one of the most important posts in the U.S. government at a critical time. He was co-founder of the Center for a New American Security and CEO of the Asia Group, served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2009 through 2013. For the past 20 years or more, Dr. Campbell has been one of the people most closely engaged with the development of American foreign policy for the Indo-Pacific region, now widely recognized as the most important strategic and economic theater for the 21st century. Long before many others understood fully the importance of the region in American foreign policy, Dr. Campbell worked to build a consensus inside and outside government to recognize and respond to emerging challenges. His contributions to American policy and strategy in the region are widely recognized around the world. Here at Hudson, we're honored to have you. We thank you for coming. We appreciate what you're doing. And I guess to begin with, I'd like to ask you maybe what some would say is the biggest question in American foreign policy today, which is how do we think about what's happening with U.S.-China relation, China in the world? What's the smart way to try to wrap our heads around this development?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Walter, respect to you. You've been a terrific commentator and thought leader on American history, American foreign policy, and I'm always appreciative when you reach out, and it's great to be at Hudson, and I look forward to this conversation today. We've asked the hardest and most important question in American foreign policy without doubt, and I would simply say that at the outset, when the Biden administration came into office, I think it was clear when there was a sort of a deep review of the information available that there was a sense in some capitals that the United States was in a process of decline, was being challenged domestically and internationally, that our industrial base was in disarray, that some of our allies were questioning our position. I think there was a general acknowledgement that the Trump administration had correctly identified some of the challenges that the United States were facing with respect to China's rise, China's increasingly provocative activities on the global stage. But I think the idea was to put in place what the president and his team hoped would be a consequential strategy that would have many elements. And I think probably the most important element was to try to erect a bipartisan consensus on the major elements of a strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And I think, Walter, you are correct that there's always been a struggle about what is the dominant theater or whether it's even appropriate to think of foreign policy in these regional terms. But if you do believe, as I do, that the lion's share of the history in the 21st century is going to be written in the Indo-Pacific, the idea is to undertake that challenge in a way that is bipartisan, that is subjected to serious internal discussion and debate, and then applied coherently on the global stage. So I think, you know, the president's general instincts are to try to work even when it's difficult in a bipartisan way. We saw that exhibited last week with respect to the budget deal. But I think beginning first with a series of discussions with partners and friends in the think tanks on Capitol Hill, I think the elements of our strategy are these. First, to invest domestically with respect to technology and capabilities. And I recognize there's lots of contention about that, questions about is there a better way to seed technology to bring manufacturing home. I'm happy to have that debate, but I think without question, the CHIPS Act and IRA, other provisions are some of the most consequential, powerful examples of the United States determining that we will not cede the high ground on technology. And technology will be the cutting edge arena of global competition in the period ahead, in the way nuclear missiles were the sort of the defining feature of the Cold War. And so I think that effort took place over the last year and a half. Simultaneously, I think what we have sought to do is to build and sustain a innovative and complex set of engagements with allies and partners. And we can talk about that in our discussion today. And that means doubling down on our bilateral relationships with Japan and South Korea and Australia, our key partners in the Indo-Pacific, linking the Indo-Pacific more with Europe. I think one of the appropriate criticisms, Walter, of the pivot that preceded this in the past was that somehow we gave the impression that we were turning away from Europe and that we were focusing exclusively on the Indo-Pacific. And I think anyone who has ever followed anything about American foreign policy understands that everything that we have done of consequence in our history, we have done largely with Europe. And I think what we've sought to do this time is to work more effectively with Europe in the Indo-Pacific. And frankly, the reverse is also true, working with Indo-Pacific partners in Europe, like on extraordinary challenges like Ukraine. This was highlighted at the Hiroshima summit, in which some of the strongest statements of support for Ukraine were found in the Indo-Pacific region as a general proposition. Innovative partnerships like AUKUS, like the Quad, trilateral engagements that bring in new partners like the Philippines, working constructively, deeply committed to the partnership with India, recognizing that this will be, in my view, the most important bilateral relationship for the United States in the 21st century. But basically trying to weave all these together in a way that sends a comprehensive message of American engagement in the region, and really weaving together a group of countries who believe in the operating system that we and other countries have helped create over 40 years in the Indo-Pacific, that has provided the greatest period of prosperity in our history. And then lastly, to undertake a careful, responsible, pragmatic diplomacy with China, recognizing that China is going nowhere, that it is important to ensure that there is appropriate diplomacy on the critical issues of our times, whether it's climate change or fentanyl or Iran, North Korea, Ukraine. Those are all topics in which it's important to compare notes, to see if we can avoid challenges, and to see in certain circumstances whether there are alignments.
And would you say at this point you feel that we're making progress with China on finding some areas of mutual cooperation? We're reading a lot of press accounts now that it's not going particularly well.
I think that's an enormous challenge. I think that would be going too far. I think the more important thing to underscore at this stage, Walter, is that the lines of communications are opening up, and we are able to lay out more constructively our areas of interest and concern. And I would highlight that one of the things that you heard from General Austin, Secretary Austin in Shangri-La, was the importance of the United States and China establishing mechanisms of communication, procedures for crisis management. China is increasingly a great power. Her forces rub up against ours much more than they did in the past. The potential for miscalculation, inadvertence is real and growing. During the Cold War, we managed to effectively create mechanisms that would allow for crisis communication in moments of unintended conflict or tension. I think it'd be fair to say we've been unable to do that yet with China. China has been reluctant to embrace and engage in some of these mechanisms. I think we and other countries, other like-minded countries, have been making the case consistently, publicly, and in private, behind closed doors, why these mechanisms are essential. And frankly, the juxtaposition of Secretary Austin making this case at the very time that a Chinese destroyer was practicing dangerous navigational tactics against a freedom of navigation mission in the Taiwan Straits, I think was absolutely clear about why this is so important.
Yep. We will definitely be talking about the regional context more, because one of the things I really do appreciate about your approach is understanding that one doesn't talk about China in separation from the rest of the region. It doesn't make sense. But just in terms of U.S.-China relations and the potential for some kind of really dramatic crisis that would reorient everything, we've heard a lot of statements from people in the U.S. military and from others in the administration about the danger that even in the rather short term, China might take action across the Taiwan Straits, or otherwise trying to compel Taiwan to accept sort of a mainland diktat over the future. How worried are you that something might happen relatively quickly?
Well, look, Walter, you put your finger on it. We have to remain vigilant. And I think, as you've seen in almost every one of our engagements, we are enlisting other countries and institutions to make the case publicly that we all have an interest in the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So I do believe that vigilance, important signaling, preparation, these are all essential features of the mission that the United States has been engaged in for decades, which is indeed this maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. We recognize the remarkable achievements of Taiwan, both in terms of its democracy and its technology. We herald that, we support it, we want to sustain it. At the same time, I think we also have to be attentive, not just about the bolt from the blue, Walter, but the challenge of the inadvertence, the miscalculation, the bumping into fighter planes and things like that can have unintended consequences. And so I think our objective at this time is to take the necessary steps to ensure that our deterrent message and actions, which are not simply military, they're across the board, are strong, are durable, are well understood, publicly communicated, and at the same time also take the necessary steps to try to prevent circumstances where unintended consequences can have terrible consequences.
You've spoken of technology as a key element in U.S. policy, and certainly it becomes clearer every day that the information revolution, information tech is becoming critical to international power, to the economic future. And there's been a lot of talk over the years about intellectual property and espionage, subsidies from China. How is the administration working to preserve what I think some have called the commanding heights of information technology?
Well, first of all, Walter, let me just say that one of the great challenges is that if you believe that the dominant issues that will translate into national power, the effectiveness in our ability to maintain global leadership with respect to semiconductors or AI or biology, synthetic biology, robotics. You can go down the list. There are a number of key technologies that are absolutely essential. This requires a very complex set of activities. It means protecting certain areas that you believe are essential in terms of your own domestic innovation, seeding some of those where necessary, working collectively with allies and partners, and then also making sure that you're taking not just bilateral but collective steps to prevent the seepage or the stealing of critical high-end capabilities to other countries. That is an incredibly difficult challenge in the best of times. But I will also say one of the hardest things is ensuring that there is a group of people in our government that are literate about technology. And that is challenging. There aren't an enormous number of people that can help design what are the capabilities of a semiconductor that are absolutely essential to maintain what you described, the sort of the leading edge. And so the effort that we are seeing that is underway now, which is a shift in focus more towards the Indo-Pacific, also involves a capacity creation inside the U.S. government, both people who know more about the Indo-Pacific, but also people who are more literate with respect to technology and can inform decision-making about things that will be critical for national power going forward.
Are you finding that the corporate sector, finance, and universities are seeing these dangers and working cooperatively with the government to address these, or is there still some pushback?
So I think it depends on the sector, Walter, to be clear. And I have found, generally speaking, one of my jobs is to do a lot of outreach with the finance community, with universities and the like. I find sometimes after an initial, session that can be somewhat heated, once we're able to listen, go through various activities that we are contemplating, things that we think are important, most of these people are patriots and they're reasonable. They hopefully see that they're sitting across the table with people that have what they believe to be the best interests of the United States also at the top of mind. I have found, generally speaking, that while not uniformly accepted, the dialogues with the academic, finance, and business community have become probably more robust over time. And I think there are elements of what is taking place in China that affect universities, businesses. And so I think where in the past, perhaps some elements of policy in the Trump administration and now in the Biden administration were questioned, I think probably less so. I think there is a recognition that there are challenges to our institutions by certain activities in China, and that there needs to be appropriate steps as a consequence.
Great. Well, let's go to kind of maybe a tour d'horizon of the regions, and we see in East Asia maybe, and always it's difficult to define. The Philippines sort of floats, but I've seen a lot of activity from the administration in all of these regions, but in the East Asia, with the Philippines, with the greater cooperation between Japan and South Korea.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, we're seeing the Chinese being more active around Taiwan and in the Straits, and we're certainly seeing North Korea continuing to raise issues of concern. How does the administration look at East Asia, and where are you confident that you're succeeding, and what worries you?
Yeah. So, look, there are a lot of issues that I think one has to be concerned by, Walter. But also there are some areas of reassurance as well. I would say that Prime Minister Kishida in Japan's hosting of the G7, probably one of the most consequential gatherings, probably didn't get the attention it deserved. But if you looked at the areas of solidarity between the United States and Europe on collective efforts on technology, on debt, on economic coercion, it's quite remarkable. And it does suggest a degree of common purpose that is, I think, important, and we intend to try to nurture that going forward. I think it is also the case that at the G7, you saw a number of groupings, both the trilateral grouping between the United States, Japan, and South Korea, the Quad, other unofficial gatherings that we think are important with respect to the fabric of strengthening the region as a whole. If you ask me what I thought the critical challenges were, though, I think the question of the American extended deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, we tend not to appreciate how important this has been to Asia's peace, Walter, for decades. There are probably 10 countries in Asia that have the capacity to build nuclear weapons that have chosen not to. And one of the key reasons that that has been the case is the sense of the durable, predictable American forward deployments of our forces, but also of our extended deterrence. When President Yoon was here just a month and a half ago, President Biden, President Yoon issued the Washington Declaration, which was designed to try to buttress through a number of steps, new mechanisms, new deployments, that America's commitment to forward extended deterrence remained rock solid. But I think we have to recognize that there are challenges to what we think has been a very favorable set of considerations when it comes to extended deterrence. One is increasing North Korean provocations. And in our diplomacy, this harkens back to an earlier question that you asked, Walter. We've made clear to China that these actions on the part of North Korea are destabilizing, and they're leading countries to reconsider their options. It's one of the factors that went into Japan's decision to up its military commitments, to basically move beyond some of the previous self-imposed constraints that they had on military capabilities. And it has also caused South Korea to rethink a number of its long-held provisions. Russia's saber rattling on the nuclear realm has also been felt across the Indo-Pacific. And it is also the case that although it has received less attention, the fact that China is in the midst of what can only be described as a massive nuclear buildup has consequences in the region as a whole. So I think going forward, Walter, it will be incumbent on this administration and future administrations to take every possible step to make clear that the United States is serious about sustaining our extended deterrent guarantees to the Indo-Pacific and to other countries. I think, secondly, I do worry vulnerable regions are under pressure. I've worked a lot in the Pacific. The Pacific are proud nations, many of which have supported us for decades. And we have a moral, historic, and strategic commitment to them. I think it would be fair to say that a succession of administrations have let the Pacific down. This is a bipartisan neglect, and it is critical for us to step up our game. This is not just voting in the UN. This is climate change as an existential issue. It is dealing with these countries as important players strategically. We need to meet them where they live with respect to the challenges that they face with respect to training and climate change and illegal fishing, and we're trying to do that. And again, this is another area where we've received a lot of encouragement from Republican friends more generally. There are a number of states in Asia that are problematic. North Korea, first and foremost. Every effort, I see my friend Jen Pristep here, who's worked on this for many years in the past, every effort at diplomacy that we've done to reach out to North Korea in recent period has failed. Everything has failed since basically the high-level diplomacy between President Trump and Kim Jong-un that ended abruptly in Vietnam. But what receives less attention is the tragedy of Burma, of Myanmar. We're deeply concerned by the humanitarian plight, the brutality of the military junta, and those issues tend to make diplomacy in ASEAN, which is the key organizing institution of Asia, much more complicated. So look, there are going to be lots of challenges here. All of these countries are stepping up their defense spending. Much of this is devoted to capabilities that are involving power projection to try to secure maritime domains that are increasingly under challenge. I think what we have generally found, Walter, is that the demand signal for American leadership in active participation is undimmed. And the hope will be whoever follows will continue to understand that the essential feature in the maintenance of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, the essential feature of basically helping to orchestrate some of these nuanced and diverse venues is in fact the United States.
Do you find in Asia that there's concern that the U.S. will be distracted by Ukraine and the crisis with Russia from a focus on the Indo-Pacific?
I would be, at the outset, I would be lying if I didn't acknowledge that I probably had some concerns for that. I don't think that should dim in any way our commitment to what's going on in Ukraine, but what we have found has been actually completely the reverse. Our diplomacy with the Indo-Pacific, if anything, has stepped up. Our diplomacy with Europe has stepped up. The connections that have formed for a variety of reasons, there is an undeniable connection to what happens in Ukraine, has implications for peace and stability in Asia, and that is not lost on any country in the region as a whole. So if anything, it has led to a deeper, more fundamental commitment to the Indo-Pacific. I think largely because there is probably a greater recognition for what the stakes are involved.
Let's turn to India, because Prime Minister Modi is coming to Washington very soon for what looks to be one of the highest profile visits by a foreign leader. State dinner, joint address to Congress. It's a lot of deliverables seem to be falling into place. What's your hopes for what will happen with this visit?
My hope is that this visit basically consecrates the U.S.-India relationship as the most important bilateral relationship for the United States on the global stage, and that we effectively make it into sort of escape velocity. And what I have seen in my own period of engaging with India, one of the most important things that has been developed in this process, yes, there will be deliverables, yes, there will be discussion about areas where we are united, areas where we still continue to have concerns. Both the United States and India are imperfect democracies. We both have challenges. I think we will be discussing it in that context. But I think what has also developed more and more between the United States and India is a degree of trust and confidence that frankly was not present a decade ago. And I think our goal will be to seek to build on that.
Mm-hmm. And that certainly seems to be a bipartisan consensus as far as
I believe
can
it
tell.
is. I believe it is. And I think everyone understands the critical role that India is playing on the global stage. That role is not, Walter, simply strategic. Many business groups, investment groups are looking at India as part of a strategy to diversify globally, new supply chains, new investment opportunities. The most impressive diaspora I've engaged with, Indian Americans in the United States, who are proud and pleased with what they see generally in terms of the embrace going forward. I think the hope will be to open up venues and activities for more investment, for more people to people. Our universities need to train many more engineers and high-tech people. And I think the general attitude of India is send me, give me this opportunity. And so we want to open those opportunities up for greater people to people across the board. So yeah, I'm grateful for the way you presented this, Walter, because I actually think that's what the stakes are involved. I think this potentially could be one of the most important sort of, juncture points with the potential for the United States and India to assume its place, this relationship, as really the critical, dynamic relationship that I think we aspire to.
To turn to Southeast Asia more, we've spoken a little bit about Myanmar, but that strikes me as, if we think of East Asia, things seem to be going fairly well in terms of relationships and developments. South Asia, as you say, we're reaching an escape velocity maybe with India, with Australia, the Pacific Islands. A lot of really good things are happening. AUKUS, of course, building new embassies on some of these Pacific Island nations and reaching out, I think, in a very important way. Southeast Asia is a little bit more complex, I think. Mm-hmm. One of the things, and I have to admit this is something I really don't understand, which is a newspaper commentator, I hate to admit, but what's happening in Thailand and how the elections in Thailand and some of the internal difficulties there play into the larger regional questions, play into Myanmar. Where are we with Thailand, and how do you see it?
Let me give you a larger picture if I can. Obviously, we engage ASEAN as an institution, and they convene the dominant diplomacy of the Indo-Pacific, and we think that's important, and the president has paid heed to that, hosted all the ASEAN leaders here last year, intends to engage actively with the ASEAN leaders. But it is also important, Walter, to recognize that ASEAN is made up of key countries, and we have to basically engage intensively with a couple of those countries, which we think will play a key role going forward. For me, the countries that I think you're beginning to see will play a central role in American strategy. Obviously, Singapore, we have a forward deployed engagement there, very close strategic dialogue. They are more an enduring, though they will face leadership changes, but an enduring feature in American strategy. But I would say Vietnam and the Philippines, with the recent visit of President Marcos, which really has ushered in a new period of closer partnership between Washington and Manila, reminiscent, but frankly different and deeper than the kind of partnership that we had during much of the Vietnam War. And we're looking forward to consequential diplomacy with Vietnam, and we recognize Vietnam's key role as a destination for more investment in technology. They have a keen strategic interests. They've played a decisive role in insisting on how to interpret issues with respect to the South China Sea. So I think those areas, are of critical importance. Thailand, we've watched carefully the election. This is a delicate phase in terms of the formation of a government. I think our goal is to sustain a strong bilateral relationship. They're our oldest treaty ally in the Indo-Pacific. We have maintained a strong relationship with them. Many companies are invested there. We have strong military programs and engagements with the Thai Armed Forces. I think it is undeniable that the politics of Thailand have been unstable and complicated. I think our goal would be to support an effective, stable democratic government in Thailand and then work consequentially with it. But this is an undeniably delicate time.
This maybe brings us to this question some people have asked, and I have asked, how does one relate the two objectives, American objectives, democracy and human rights kind of diplomacy, which is clearly important to the president and to this administration, and then the realities of a strategic competition, which have their own logic, so that a country like, for example, Vietnam might be a problematic issue for a place from a human rights or democracy point of view, but is critical from a strategic point of view. How does the administration manage that?
Look, I having spent a little bit of time with the president, Walter, I think it would be fair to say that I think the president is less about outward and ostentatious proselytizing about democracy and human rights, and more about trying to let our model and our attempt to deal with our own challenges be a kind of model for how other countries might want to deal with their own challenges. There is always tension in the formulation and execution of American statecraft. There is that tension between domestic economic engagement and international economic strategy. I'm sure a point you'll get to. There are questions about like the preferencing of regions one over the other, how to think about assistance versus investment, and the question about it is undeniable that some of the most effective countries in East Asia are not democracies. And how do you recognize then that in your strategy going forward? I think the president understands, and the administration, that we can be for something but still engage on other terms. And I think that's what we've sought to do. And we are seeking broad and sustained partnerships with a variety of countries in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that is both smart and sustainable.
Okay. In economics, it seems to me we've got sort of two big sets of issues. One would be that for many in the region, at least when I talk to people, what I constantly hear is trade, and by trade they generally mean access to the U.S. market as an engine for development. It's probably important for folks watching this to understand that we're talking about many countries where there's deep poverty and a tremendous social pressure to increase living standards, especially now that with cell phones and the internet, people are much more aware of the gap between their living standards and other parts of the world, and this becomes a real source of worry and political instability. The U.S. leadership on free trade is widely seen there as a great engine for growth. Here it's a much more controversial topic now, both on the left and in parts of the right these days. So how does the Biden administration plan to navigate this particular shoal?
Well, look, first of all, Walter, I think I like the way you began this, put this in the larger context, what some of the challenges are. Trade is contested politically inside the United States, but there are some facts that are just undeniable. First of all, the U.S. market is one of the most open markets of any country in the world. Trade with Asia last year was at an all-time high. It is also the case that American investment, we are by and large the largest investor in the Indo-Pacific in many different countries. And so we are deeply intertwined, and our commercial and investment sector view the Indo-Pacific as the dominant theater for the 21st century. So that is all undeniable. I think it is the case that there is a belief that some of the previous trade negotiations tended to focus on areas that were perhaps more controversial now. Corporatist interests that were perhaps not as transferable to the lives of, you talked about the lives of people outside of the United States looking in. I think we also have to be attentive to those people who are affected by global trade, particularly what might be described as unfair global trade, some of the things that we've seen, particularly with respect to the practices of China. So I think it would be fair to say that there has been an effort to reconceptualize certain areas that we think are going to be central going forward. Supply chains, issues associated with climate, labor, a variety of provisions, taxation that we think are crucial elements of economic engagement. And so what the Biden administration has sought to do with IPEF is to create a really new kind of venue in which many of these issues would be hammered out in ways that would level the playing field, create more predictability with respect to critical minerals and vulnerable supply chains, and essentially feature a enhanced ability to do business, not just with the dominant economies of Northeast Asia, but dynamic, important economies of Southeast Asia. So for the first time, India is involved in a trade negotiation like this with the United States, so as Fiji, a Pacific Island nation. So these, obviously there are questions about how significant this will be. I think our view is that this will, and we'll have more to say about this when the United States hosts APEC later this year, that this will turn out to be much more consequential than some of the critics have suggested. And I would just remind folks that when we started diplomacy around TPP, which is now hailed by some, it was criticized as being lacking in ambition, not significant, not the right partners. So I do want to underscore that we understand, like anyone who focuses on the Indo-Pacific, that the ticket to the big game in Asia is that you've got to engage on trade and economics and commerce. It is not sufficient to be a security player. You've got to be a full-purpose, full-spectrum player in the Indo-Pacific, and that's exactly what I think this administration, backed up by strong support in Congress, believes what's essential.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say that IPEF is seen in some ways as a negotiating forum where we can deal with some of the questions that have made trade unpopular in the United States, whether it's labor standards, environmental, intellectual property, and some of these other things, with the idea that then one comes back as IPEF matures, a basis for deeper trade engagement? Is that the strategy?
Look, I think that's part of what we're getting at. The honest truth, though, is, Walter, we're actually looking for more immediate deliverables. One of the things that was clear over the course of the last couple of years during COVID and other challenges is that supply chains are challenged and they need to be diversified. These countries all have said, we want to play a larger role in your supply chains, and these mechanisms will make that more effective and more predictable. So I don't think this is ethereal or somehow theoretical. This is deeply practical. It's meant to tackle the specific issues that we're confronting today.
Yep. And definitely, as you say, supply chains where we're looking to diversify from China for some of these things is a potential opportunity for others to replace China in that supply chain.
Yeah.
Yep. one question I find I hear not only from people in the region, but from sort of young people and students and others in the U.S. is, what's the goal in Asia? You know, we're concerned about the rise of China, the international system. What is it that what would be the point, the goal? How do we know whether we're making progress? How would you describe that?
So look, I remember talking to a guy that I was in the Navy with, and we were out, on patrol, and he said to me, I deploy, therefore I am, and that's not how we see strategy. And so, I would say the way to think about this, Walter, is, sometimes you hear from Chinese interlocutors that the United States is set at containment or keeping China down. I would just, take a very different tact. I believe that the last 40 to 50 years have been the very best years in Asia's history. And we've led billions of people out of poverty, increased livelihoods,
and including in China, of course.
Fantastic innovation, and a number of countries have benefited from that, including China, as Walter just said. And the reason for this is not just the hard work and ingenuity of the people involved, although that is an undeniable feature of it. It is that this happened within a larger context in which this, what we might describe as an operating system, to stay with technology, this operating system that the United States helped create and sustain with the support of others, which has many factors with it: the forward deployment of American forces, the commitment to peaceful resolution of disputes, the ideas of legal abilities to solve problems, freedom of navigation. There are a whole collection, Walter, of features to that system, imperfect but undeniable, that woven together created the fabric for remarkable peace and prosperity. It is not a surprise that China, as a rising state, like any countless times in history, seeks to amend or adjust elements of this dominant existing system. But I think the concern that we and other countries in the Indo-Pacific has is that many of these changes, if implemented, like economic coercion or arbitrary territorial features, you can go down the list, if implemented, would have very negative consequences for the livelihoods of countries and people in the Indo-Pacific, and I would argue maybe even for China. And so I see much of what the United States is seeking to do is to preserve, sustain, and update an operating system that has worked remarkably well for us. And so frankly, we've found that many other countries in the Indo-Pacific and indeed in Europe recognize the salience of that argument and want very much to be part of the effort to sustain a series of mechanisms and institutions that have been stabilizing. We all recognize that they have to evolve. They have to increasingly deal with the challenges of the global South, poor peoples, but at the same time recognizing some of the key features of the global system and how it's been very good to us. And so I sense that I think we can do a better job, Walter, in explaining this. Sometimes these, what look like, why are we prosecuting freedom of navigation? Why do we insist on statements in the G7 that talk about lending practices that create more poverty? Why are we focused on economic coercion? It is because if these practices become dominant, we believe that it will have a deeply antithetical set of interests or consequences for the region that we care so very much about. That's probably an inadequate answer, but I do not believe this is about sustaining American dominance or somehow seeking to keep any country down. This is simply about a set of steps that we believe that are in the best interests of the lion's share of the countries in the Indo-Pacific and Europe.
Let me just take the liberty of throwing out some thoughts I've had about trying to frame this problem, because I do basically agree with everything you just said. But when I look at the history of Asia and of the American engagement in the Indo-Pacific, it looks to me like we've had a series of crises essentially driven by uneven development, so that the British and the Europeans established colonial empires because they achieved kind of industrial development earlier than Asian societies. Then in Asia itself, Japan develops earlier than others, which creates a kind of an unhealthy sense in Japan of its regional role and led to untold tragedies. Today, something similar with China, as the Indian economy was 65% of China's in 1980 and is about 17% today. Wow. And that imbalance, in a sense, sort of can create unreasonable expectations in China about its role, but also creates real imbalances that an external power like the U.S. takes an interest in. And possibly, if we were to think that if Asia were to all be developing, that we reach the point of full development of Asian societies, there's a kind of a natural balance of power, natural order in the region that no one country, even, certainly not us, but even India and China, couldn't think about a hegemony in a place that's so rich and so large. And maybe part of our role is to allow that natural development of Asia towards some kind of peaceful state. Is that a useful way to think about things?
I'd want to think about it a little bit more, Walter. It's interesting. I would say that, look, taking the longer view, like let's say the last 40 or 50 years, not but I would say that we tend to get in trouble during periods in which American power is questioned. And we've seen that on a number of occasions. We saw it during the Korean War when our forces were overrun at the beginning. A lot of questions about whether the fighting spirit was lost after the victories of the Second World War. Many of our closest allies were concerned by the rout in Vietnam, subsequently thinking about their own nuclear developments, going their own way. It took real courage of people in the Reagan administration to reassert American power in East Asia. At the end of the Cold War, there was a sense that the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union, had exhausted one another, and Japan had prevailed. And then during the economic crisis in 2007, 2008, a sense that for all of our lecturing that American financial institutions had been shown to be imperfect, during much of that, questions about American staying power and American commitment, and that is seeded and furthered by questions about either domestic disarray or preoccupation, right? And so I think my biggest takeaway, Walter, during this period is that if we can send a signal of American constancy and engagement that's bipartisan, that is resourced, that is not just military, and that we are seen as a steady and a deeply engaging presence across all political players along the lines that your previous question. And frankly, most of these countries want to see a careful, purposeful diplomacy between the United States and China. If we can do that, I think it is easier to sustain the kind of peace and stability that you describe. I think what concerns me, even in that framework, is that it is undeniable beginning, in the late 1990s, what we've seen is a massive military investment on the part of China. And that's not something that's noted just by the United States, but by every country in the region. And I've had many diplomatic interlocutors in Southeast Asia and elsewhere say, why do they need this kind of investment? Shouldn't they be investing more in the healthcare system or in retirement and the like? And so those questions remain, and I think the imbalances are clear, but it's not just the imbalances, it's what you spend your public financing on. And some of those military investments are creating anxieties. And people don't always talk about it, but they are creating anxieties across the region as a whole. So my general answer to you, Walter, is that if you ask me again what's necessary, I think institution building, true norm building, in which we learn some of the lessons of the WTO and like how allowing certain state activities to undermine practices, creating problems in host countries and undermining the public support for trade. Those are all things that we have to be attentive to. But at the same time, I do believe it is going to be strong, purposeful American engagement that will turn out to be decisive.
Yep. Well, thank you very much. You've been
Walter.
Generous with your time and generous, I think, with the range of your answers. Thank you to the audience for coming. We won't be engaged in a Q&A today. Okay.
Thank you, Walter.
Well,
thank you. It's okay about
right.
that part.
And I know you've got some important engagements that you have to get to, so we'll try to let you get going quickly. But again, thank you all for coming, and thank you very much. It's great to see you.